The Gospel of Mark. In this lecture, we'll take a typical approach at the beginning for introductory examinations of the New Testament writings, where we look at the introductory questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who was the author? What was the date and the place of this gospel? But the gospel will get us into the why question, and the focus on who Jesus was is also an answer to the question of why. The how will have to do with structure, or to the extent we can talk about structure in Mark's gospel. But how does he write this work of his in the 16 chapters that we have? And then we'll explore some further issues beyond that in terms of titles of Jesus in Mark's Gospel, and conclude with a comment about Jesus' divinity in Mark's Gospel. We won't always follow a full examination of the introductory questions for the different books of the New Testament. That really is, in my view, what we're asking of the textbook to do, and so repeating it in lecture format is just not what you need out of the course. So I'm depending on your reading the textbook and getting your information along those lines from there. It is always an introduction to those questions. There are deeper studies than the textbook that you have on those issues. Too often the focus in introductions to the New Testament is on just those issues, and you get a very little opportunity to get into questions of what's the actual content of the books we're studying and what's really going on. We've begun this course by looking at issues broader than those introductory issues. It's only now that we're coming to Mark's Gospel, for example, our first book in the New Testament to look at. And so I am trying to give you through the lectures the kind of lenses you need for reading the text, rather than answering all the introductory questions book by book. So without further ado, let's move on to the question of authorship, because there are some points that I want to make about all the Gospels that are interesting, and particularly I want to emphasize the fact that the Gospels are written by people who have eyewitness testimony. They were either eyewitnesses or they have eyewitness testimony that they can report. So the answer to the question of authorship of the Gospel of Mark is that Mark, through Peter's eyewitness testimony, was the author. Now, don't think that that's an obvious answer, because we do have to reckon with the fact that titles to the Gospels are not part of what is original. We will argue later on that very, very early on, titles must have been given to the Gospels. But still, Mark did not sit down and write and say, this is Mark writing this Gospel on such and such a date, and so forth. Any kind of information about authorship is added later by the church. And by later, I would say still in the 1st century. Now, in the early 2nd century, we have the witness of Papias. That is important for all the Gospels, including Mark. Papias' writings have not survived independently, so we have access to them through a writer in the early 4th century named Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history. Eusebius' ecclesiastical history is the earliest history that we have of the church. We have some other attempts at history, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla from the 2nd century, but they're not a whole history of the early church. And of course, in the New Testament, we do have the Gospels and Acts functioning as historical records. Anyway, Eusebius offers us a view of the history of the church up until his time in the early 4th century. And so is a very important work to answer various questions about what was going on in the church at this time in the first 3 centuries. Papias says in the early 2nd century, according to Eusebius, and the presbyter used to say this: Mark became Peter's translator and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said or done by the Lord. For he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him, but later on, as I said, followed Peter, who used to tell brief incidents about Jesus, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard, and to make no false statements in them. Now, Richard Bauckham has recently, that is in 2006, written a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. This is a technical but very important book. And one of the technical sides to the book is his examination of what Papias says about the different Gospels. The notes on the screen for the word translator and so forth are coming from Bauckham's analysis of what Papias has said. So, first of all, Mark was not a translator in the sense of someone taking Aramaic and translating it into Greek, for example, but rather the one who took the words of Peter and put them into a written form. Second point to make here is that Papias says that he used the brief incidents about Jesus that Peter would tell in constructing his gospel, and then finally that he did not make an arrangement of the Lord's oracles. Now, in classical rhetoric, the idea of making an arrangement of your speech or your rhetoric was one of the most important things that you would study. What kind of arrangement do you give to something? And what Mark is not accused of doing is adding anything to what Peter said. So Papias is saying that in making the arrangement, or rather in telling the story of Mark, he doesn't add things himself or insert his own interpretation into the text, but rather just collected what Peter had said in these short, brief incidents in Jesus' life. So Mark is made out by Papias to be someone who isn't an author in the sense of creating a story, but merely translates what Peter had said onto paper. In that way, then, the answer to who is the author of Mark's Gospel has to be Mark, according to Papias. But what Mark is doing is he's presenting the eyewitness testimony of Peter. There are other claims that Mark was the author that we should just note that come from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. We have Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, and of course Eusebius himself in referencing Papias. Mark was not only associated with Peter but also with Paul and Barnabas, as you may remember from passages in Acts, and he's mentioned in other parts of the New Testament. And while there's a rift between Mark and Paul, nevertheless, in Paul's last letter in 2 Timothy, Paul states his appreciation for Mark. There's some reconciliation between them, whatever the issues were. As to place, we are going to conclude that Mark wrote in Italy, perhaps in Rome. The anti-Marcionite prologue to Mark states that Mark was written in the regions of Italy. Marcion was a heretic from the 2nd century A.D., and so the anti-Marcionite prologue to Mark adds this point about his writing in the regions of Italy. Irenaeus is also from the 2nd century, and so is Clement of Alexandria. Both testify to the place being Italy. There are also what we might call Latinisms in Mark's Gospel. That is, terms that are really Roman words that were written into Greek form and letters. And so examples would be the widow's 2 copper coins are said to be equivalent to quadrantes, which is a Roman coin. And the courtyard is called a praetorian in Mark's Gospel, which of course is again a Roman word. That suggests that the audience is familiar with such terms as these, and they would have been particularly relevant to people living in Italy. Bear in mind, the Gospel is being written in Greek, and Greek is the lingua franca, the common language of the Roman Empire. Even something written in Italy gets written in Greek. Paul's letter to the Romans is written in Greek. So even in Rome, you'll find Greek as a language that people will use to speak to one another if they are not themselves Roman and speaking to one another. But the church is a mixed church right from the beginning. Jews in the church in Rome, for example, are from different parts of the empire. And the language that we find throughout the New Testament is the language of Greek. So when we find Latinisms in the text, it's an influence from the Roman Empire, and perhaps particularly for something written where Latin was more commonly spoken in Italy. The mention of Simon of Cyrene's sons, Alexander and Rufus, is also interesting. In Mark 15:21, we see another reference to Rufus in Paul's greetings to the church at Rome in Romans 16, verse 13. So the mention in Mark's Gospel of Rufus may well be because the church there actually knows him and his brother Alexander. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Mark is located in Rome with Peter, another strong indication of place for Mark's Gospel and for the connection between Mark and Peter. Now, all this evidence is not conclusive in some sort of absolute way. Some scholars have suggested alternatives to Rome, but this is the kind of argument that persuades most people that the Gospel of Mark is written in Rome or in Italy. As to date, we can talk about when Mark was written in terms of persecution, the phrase desolating sacrilege, and Peter's death. Most scholars think Mark was written in the 60s. The persecution of the church in Rome at that time fits the emphasis on suffering, discipleship, and fear in witnessing in Mark's Gospel. Mark ends in verse 8 of chapter 16. If you look at that chapter, you'll see that your translation will have verses that go through verse 20, but most translations will have some explanation about verses 9 through 20 that say that those verses are not found in the earliest manuscripts. Indeed, they are an addition. So what we have of what is really Mark's Gospel is the ending is in verse 8 of chapter 16. When you look at verse 8 in chapter 16, you see that the reference ends, the verse is about the two women from the tomb who are fearful and they don't say anything to anybody. Now that kind of an ending has led some people to say, well, we've lost the original ending to Mark's Gospel, which is why we have this other edition ending from a later time in some manuscripts. Another answer would be that, well, Mark actually intended to leave the Gospel at a place that creates some concern. In the context of persecution, what are the readers going to do? Are they going to say nothing to anyone? Are they going to be fearful? Or are they going to continue steadfast and continue on the witness that they ought to be giving to Jesus Christ? Persecution of the church took place under Nero in the 60s. And Nero, according to tradition, had both Paul and Peter put to death. Now that relates to the third point, that if Peter dies because of Nero, then he must die before Nero himself dies. And Nero died in AD 68. That then places Mark's Gospel before Nero's death in AD 68. The second point here on the screen is about the desolating sacrilege, a reference that we find in Mark chapter 13, verse 14. Jesus, on the Mount of Olives, or the apocalyptic discourse in Mark 13, makes reference to the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be. And this phrase of desolating sacrilege is something that comes from Daniel. Now, Daniel had in mind that desolating sacrilege of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 167 BC, when he enters Jerusalem, robs the temple, and orders that sacrifices of pigs ought to be made on the altar of the Holy of Holies. That idea of a wicked ruler who would set up a desolating sacrilege then is reused by Jesus typologically to refer to something still future. And in Luke's Gospel, when Luke comes to that same place, he says, instead of desolating sacrilege, he says, when you see armies surrounding the city. And so he has in mind the destruction of Jerusalem in the First Jewish War, the destruction of Jerusalem taking place in AD 70. So desolating sacrilege may just be vague enough in Mark's Gospel to suggest that Mark is written before the event took place and before Mark could clarify it in the way that Luke did. It's these kind of arguments that lead scholars to say that Mark's Gospel is written in the 60s. Some might even put it earlier, but not later than 68. Now we find in the very first verse of Mark's Gospel the word gospel. Just what do we mean by this? We read, "The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Now there's some background that's rather important for our understanding what gospel is. Gospel, we're going to explore not as a literary genre, as a type of literature, first and foremost, but rather what the term might have meant to people reading Mark 1:1. We talk about the four Gospels and refer to that as a kind of literature. But Mark 1:1 is not talking about a type of literature, a story put together about Jesus. It's rather talking about the good news. And what we find is that in Greek literature, the term was often used to refer to the emperor. Friedrich, in his article on the word gospel in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, says that the term was applied to the emperor who was believed to be divine. It was used in reference to the good news of events in his life, particularly the announcement of a birth of someone who would become emperor, his coming of age, and especially to his accession to the throne. Isaiah's use of the term gospel, or the verbal form of it, is also of interest. And although we might have different forms of the word, it is the same root word that we have in view here in the red from the passages listed here. C.C. Broyles has argued that the term gospel needs to be appreciated as a reference back to Isaiah 40 through 66, where it occurs in 4 places. Isaiah 40 verse 9, "Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good tidings." This translation has. "Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God." Now this language of good tidings appears in Isaiah 49, which is the passage that immediately follows the passage that explains who John the Baptist is. John the Baptist is the one who is a voice crying in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." The news that this messenger gives is the news of the return of Israel from exile. Make the way straight. The valleys are lifted up, the hills are flattened. A clear and easy path for exiles to return to Israel is made. And now we hear in verse 9 that this is good news, that your God has come. This is a restoration of the people of Israel from exile. Isaiah 52 verse 7 says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." So the content of the good news, the gospel, is the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is that the reign of God will now begin, and the time of exile has come to an end. Now, what I'm hoping you're seeing is the beginning of the connection between Jesus' proclamation of kingdom of God and the use of the word gospel in the New Testament that has to do with the reign of God. That reign of God is going to focus on the one who brought that reign, Jesus Christ. Isaiah 60 verse 6 says, "A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense and shall proclaim good news, the praise or salvation, as the Septuagint has it, of the Lord." And then in Isaiah 61:1, we have the words that Jesus quoted in his first sermon in Nazareth, according to Luke chapter 4. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners." So the language of good news is from Isaiah. The language of gospel is from Isaiah. It has to do with the restoration of the people of Israel from captivity and the coming of God, who brings salvation for his people and restores them to live in his kingdom according to his righteousness. Several good news themes are announced in Mark 1:1 through 15. Firstly, God's salvation is announced. John prepares the way of the Lord. All flesh shall see God's glory, or God's salvation, as we read in Isaiah 40 verse 5. Note Isaiah 43, 11 through 12. I am the Lord, and beside me there is no Savior. I declared and saved and proclaimed. God is the Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, the Creator of Israel, Israel's King, is the language we find in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 43. Secondly, there's forgiveness of sins that is announced in Mark 1, 1 through 15. John comes preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Isaiah 43 verse 25 says, I am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake, and I will not remember your sins. Thirdly, there's God's Son who is announced. Jesus, God's beloved Son, is given the Spirit in Mark 1, 10 through 11, when Jesus is baptized. The allusion to Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4 is clear. The passage in Isaiah 42 is, again, the same theme that we find in these other chapters of Isaiah 40 and 43 that we've been noting. And in 42, the servant of the Lord is the one in whom God is well pleased, and on whom the Spirit of God is placed. Then fourth, the kingdom of God is announced. Mark 1, 14 through 15 contain the words of Jesus that the words of the kingdom that have to do with the repenting and hearing the good news, the gospel. Isaiah 52 verse 7 we have already noted about proclaiming on the mountains, your God reigns, your God reigns. So the language of kingdom then is also introduced with respect to gospel. Near the end of Mark's gospel, the centurion declares confessionally that the one he sees dying on the cross is the Son of God. And when the centurion, Mark 15 verse 39 says, when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. This confession of the centurion takes us right back to Mark 1:1, where Mark says that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's the Messiah, the Son of God. The story in between those verses then is the story of how the reader comes to see that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God as well. In the middle of Mark's gospel, we find a momentous realization by the disciples as to Jesus' identity. In Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 30, we hear the story of how Jesus asks his disciples in the region of Caesarea Philippi, who do people say that I am? And then his disciples list various options. Well, you're John the Baptist, or you're Elijah, or some other one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And this is where Peter then gives his confession. You are the Christ. That is, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus warns them not to tell anyone about him. Note that this is also where Jesus introduces a new element in the gospel as to his identity, a cruciform understanding of who he is. Yes, he is the Messiah, the one who's coming to reign, but you also need to understand that the Son of Man must undergo great sufferings, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Mark 8:31. Well, that will be an important passage that will give us some insight into structure, the structure of Mark's Gospel. Papias' comments lead us to say, lead us not to expect much in the way of arrangement and structuring in Mark's Gospel. And that's really true. We can look at an attempt by Don Carson and Douglas Moo and Leon Morris in their introduction to the New Testament to give some kind of an arrangement to Mark's Gospel. for example, they talk about the preliminaries to ministry and the summary of ministry that we've just gone over in chapters 1 through 15. And then they talk about a Galilean ministry that runs from 1:16 all the way to 8:26 that has 3 parts to it. Now you'll notice the difficulty of giving some definition to these parts as if they're clear and obvious sections. Part 1, 1:16 to 3:6, says events showing, they say these are events showing controversy with Jewish leaders, the forgiveness of sins, fellowship with tax collectors and sinners, the disciples' failure to fast regularly, and some word about the Sabbath. And then part 2 shows Jesus' popularity, his healing, his exorcism, the kingdom, and growing opposition. Now, what does make more sense is to talk about some more microstructuring in Mark's gospel rather than the macrostructure of the whole gospel. And here we could note that there's an arrangement in chapter 4 of 4 parables over 34 verses. And then also that there are 4 miracles that are grouped together right after that that show types of Jesus' work. There's a nature miracle, that is the calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee. There's an exorcism. Then that's followed just a few verses later by a healing miracle. And then just going backwards to the raising from the dead, a story that takes place in verses 21 to 24 and then in verses 35 to 43 of chapter 5. So we find those 4 types of miracles arranged together right after the 4 parables. And then in part 3 we have Jesus moving on to Nazareth. Themes continue and to intensify, they say. The disciples show a lack of understanding. The 12 are sent out on a mission, and then there's the miraculous feeding and so forth. It's a Galilean ministry, but it really does read the way Papias said it does. That is, here are short stories that Mark is going to put down without much attention to arrangement, that he is recording because they are eyewitness testimony of Peter. Now, after Peter's recognition that Jesus is the Messiah in chapter 8, Jesus does begin to say, and the Son of Man must suffer and die. And these, there are 3 such statements by Jesus in the next section of Mark's Gospel, in 8:27 through 10:52. They have the same format. Jesus predicts his death. What follows is the disciples misunderstand this, and then Jesus goes on to teach on the cost of discipleship. That is, the impending suffering and death of Jesus is related in each of these 3 pericope to the cost of discipleship. Will they follow Jesus, who is going to suffer and die? Reckon with the fact that discipleship is costly. And these occur in chapters 8, 9, and 10, as you see. Then there's a section that they label as the final ministry in Jerusalem, so following a time of ministry in Galilee. We have this section of ministry in Jerusalem in 11, 12, and 13. And then we have the Passion and Empty Tomb narratives from 14:1 to 16:8. We've already talked about how verses 9 through 20 of chapter 16 are a later addition to the original of Mark's Gospel. As we look at expectations in the first century for the Messiah, we might begin with a document from the Qumran community. Qumran community is probably an Essene community living in the wilderness of Judea in the northwest territory of the Dead Sea. A very important document associated with Qumran is the community rule, talking about the nature of their community. And in it, we read something of their expectations of ones to come, messianic figures, we might say. And it's interesting to see that they have more than one idea. It's not just a single idea, and it's not just a single person in view. So we read, "The men of holiness who walk in perfection shall depart from none of the counsels of the law to walk in the stubbornness of their hearts, but shall be ruled by the primitive precepts in which the men of the community were first instructed, until there shall come the prophet and the Messiahs of Aaron and Israel." The Messiah of Aaron is mentioned also later on in that document, and it probably refers to a priestly Messiah. The Messiah of Israel probably is equivalent to the son of David, the kingly, the political Messiah, which was a very common view as well. But then we also have this language of the prophet who is to come. And this same idea is mentioned in Peter's speech in Solomon's portico after the healing of the man who had been lame from birth, that Peter and John had come into contact with, Acts chapter 3. And Peter refers to the very same verse that other Jews refer to, which we can turn to now on the next slide. It's Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 and 19. And it's a verse that is very important for the Samaritans and their understanding of the future coming prophetic person, one who is like Moses, who is going to be a restorer. And Deuteronomy 18:18 then begins, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. Anyone who does not heed the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold accountable." So here we have an idea of a prophet to come who's associated with Moses. The speech in Acts chapter 3 talks about various prophets who came after Moses, and then in addition to that, one who would be raised up. And that reference is taken to refer to Jesus himself. So he is the ultimate prophetic restorer, like Moses. And the idea of a prophet is also found elsewhere in Judaism. One who would come. And it is especially poignant, as it were, in the first century, because for a long time there seemed to have been no prophets, as Josephus suggests, in Jewish war and in Apion, against Apion. But there was a minor revival by the time of Jesus. There were prophets among the Essenes, Pharisees, and Zealots. A few messianic prophets tried to lead the people in revolt against the Romans. And in particular, there were hopes of the return of Elijah. And Malachi chapters 3 and 4 are significant for that. We see the application of this made to John the Baptist. It seems as if you can entertain the idea of more than one fulfillment of passages like this, where there are instances of representing what is ultimate, and then there is the ultimate one to come. And those kind of ultimate ideas are often turned to Jesus himself. So is he the prophet as well? Now the people regarded Jesus as possibly a prophet. There are a number of passages in different Gospels that suggest this, but note that they also thought the same of John the Baptist as a prophet. It wasn't a unique status for Jesus to be a prophet, although it was an important one. Also, Jesus' behavior seems to suggest he could be understood as a prophet. He had a sense of divine calling and claimed to be anointed with the Spirit. He probably regarded himself as a prophet, as some texts suggest. He claimed to be God's representative as well. He claimed a direct knowledge of God and his will. And he had ecstatic experiences, as prophets do, at his baptism and transfiguration, in the temptation as well. And then many of his sayings had a prophetic character, seen in their ethical and eschatological thrust. Some of his actions resembled prophetic symbolism, such as his cleansing the temple, or his cursing the fig tree, or his riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. We might then ask, did Jesus think of himself as the prophet? And just what might that mean? There's some very interesting material from the Gospels around this. And I would like to suggest that Jesus intentionally brought to mind, through his ministry, the connection between the prophet Moses and Elijah and Elisha, so that people would make connections between what he was doing and what was done once before. Firstly, Jesus and Moses. There is the theme of the new Exodus in Jesus' ministry. The prophets spoke of another Exodus like the Exodus that the Israelites went through when they left Egypt. The new Exodus was when they would come out of exile, the northern kingdom having gone into exile in 722 BC and the southern kingdom in 587, 586 BC. And the prophets spoke not only of that exile, but also of a restoration from exile, which would be similar to what took place when Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt. So this new Exodus motif can be found in the prophets, as we have already seen in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 and so forth, but also in Isaiah. And this is an interesting example. In Matthew 11, 2 through 5, John the Baptist in prison hears what Jesus is doing. And so he sends his disciples to ask the question, are you the one to come, or should we expect someone else? Should we wait for another? And Jesus answered them with words that reflect the prophecies of Isaiah. Jesus says, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. Those words that Jesus sends back to John the Baptist are words that allude to the passages of Isaiah 29, 18 and 19, 35, 5 and 6, and Isaiah 61. The whole section there is verses 1 through 3, some words within those verses. Jesus is doing what was expected at the time of the new Exodus. So the answer to John the Baptist is, yes, I am the Messiah. I am doing these things. But the new Exodus brings to mind the first Exodus with Moses. And so the second point here is that Jesus is like a second Moses. He is tested in the wilderness for 40 days. Now, that could be also said, it could also be said, and should be said, that here Jesus is also like Israel. He takes on himself the role of Israel, but also, of course, Moses is the leader of Israel in the wilderness. And he performs miracles like Moses did when they left Egypt as well as in the wilderness, as he led his people through the wilderness. And he utters commandments on a mountain, just as Moses received the commandments from God on a mountain. And according to Acts chapter 3, verses 22 and 23, the parallel between Jesus and Moses is made explicit. Jesus was seen as the prophet like Moses. Now, that doesn't exhaust our understanding of Jesus as, let's say, a significant prophet or the prophet to come. So we need to see the parallels between Jesus and Elijah and Elisha,
which we can look at after this slide in a chart form. But just note here that Jesus compares himself to Elijah and Elisha explicitly in Luke 4:25-27. The evangelists, the gospel writers, portray Jesus as a second Elijah. Again, Luke 7:11-17. And Jesus regarded John the Baptist as a second Elijah, according to Matthew 17:12 and following. Now, on that point, note that we have two different identifications of the second Elijah. And that's because it's not saying that Elijah's come back from the dead and this is him, but rather what's happening now in the ministry of the kingdom that both John the Baptist and Jesus are involved in. We have something like what was going on in the great prophets of Elijah and Elisha, specifically Elijah in this case. And what's important here to note is that Elijah is expected in Malachi to precede the coming of God's reign. And so when the parallel is made with Elijah and or Elisha, then we have a statement not only that Jesus is like a prophet, but he is the prophet to bring God's reign, to bring in God's kingdom. And in John's gospel, John the Baptist denied that he was the prophet because that title made him too great in comparison to who Jesus was. And now, finally then, note that at Jesus' transfiguration, both Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus. And in that sense, we have the two great prophets testifying to Jesus as the one who represents what they were doing. There's continuity between their ministries, and yet they also disappear. And so while their testimony is there to Jesus, Jesus is the greater of the three.
In this table, we are going to compare the Elijah and Elisha stories to stories of John and Jesus and characterizations of them. And what you see is the remarkable similarities. Elijah helps the woman of Zarephath and her son, and Zarephath is in the region of Tyre and Sidon. So we read that Jesus helps a woman of the region of Tyre and Sidon and her daughter. Elijah travels 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, and Jesus fasts for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. Both are wilderness experiences. Elijah is described in a way that's similar to John. He was a hairy man with a leather belt about his waist, and John wore camel's hair clothing with a leather belt about his waist. What we might say about that is that John intentionally is taking on the role of Elijah in his ministry. Elijah and Elisha are at the Jordan River near Jericho when Elijah is taken away in a chariot, and Elisha receives a double portion of Elijah's spirit, which he had asked for. Similarly, John and Jesus are found at the Jordan River, and John says that Jesus is greater than he is. The Spirit descends on Jesus at his baptism. The prophecy in Malachi chapter 4 verse 5 is, "Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." And that is referenced in several passages in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 6, 8, 9, and 15. Furthermore, Elisha, on an occasion, encounters a Shunammite woman who grabs his feet in great distress to ask for help because her son has died. 2 Kings 4. And a woman grasps the hem of Jesus' garment to ask for help for herself in Mark 5. Elijah, again, and the widow of Zarephath's son, reminds one of another story when Jesus restores a life to a girl. It's the story that is connected to the previous story just mentioned in Mark 5 of the woman grasping the hem of Jesus' garment. Then Elisha restores the Shunammite woman's dead son, uh, and Jesus restores the widow of Nain's dead son. And the map on the side of this table shows that Shunem is on the south side of a mountain and Nain is on the north side of the same mountain. So in the same region, uh, the same kind of miracle takes place. And people would certainly have identified Jesus in terms of Elisha at the time regarding that. And similarly, Elisha feeds 100 people with 20 barley loaves and fresh ears of corn, and then some food is left over. Jesus feeds the multitude of 5,000 plus women and children, and then a group of 4,000 with food left over on both occasions. And then Elisha heals a leper who is a Syrian, and also Jesus heals 10 lepers, one of whom is a Samaritan. So the healing of the lepers is associated with those who are unclean, those who are not Jews, the Syrians or the Samaritans. We've already talked about revolutionary movements at the time, and I have just referenced that the Dictionary of Jesus in the Gospels has a good article on this as well. Now, with that kind of background for messianic expectations, we turn to Mark's Gospel. And the first thing we need to note is that the title Christ is a Greek word. It comes from kreo, which means I anoint. And so the Christ is the anointed one. And therefore Christ is simply a Greek translation for the Hebrew word Messiah, which also means anointed one. Now in the Old Testament, we note that prophets were anointed, as in 1 Kings 19 verse 16. Priests were anointed, as we find in Exodus 40 verse 13. And kings were anointed. Psalm 2:2, Psalm 132, Daniel 9:26, for example. So, what is meant by Christ? Jesus Christ. Is he a prophet, a priest, or a king? Once again, we have possible multiple allusions with the title. The title appears twice in Mark. In chapter 1, verse 1, we read the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then in Mark 9:41, for truly I tell you, whoever gives a cup of water to drink, because you bear the name of Christ, will by no means lose the reward. Now, one of the questions that lurks in current translation concerns is whether the title Christ is equivalent to Son of God. And just note that with Mark 1:1. We will address this issue, but at this point, having just read that verse, make note of the question. Is Son of God equivalent to the title Christ here in Mark 1:1, or does it capture something else, perhaps overlapping, but nevertheless different? So the language of Son or Son of God is language that can refer to different beings, different people. It can refer to angels. It can refer to Israel. You are my son. It can refer to the king as God's son. And it can be taken as a messianic title. Now in the Psalms, we have a number of Psalms that are kingly or courtly psalms, like Psalm 2. And probably they had their origin in the courts of the king and referred to the king at the time. They were songs sung in the king's court. But because the Messiah is going to be the ultimate king, the ultimate son of David. So these courtly psalms take on a prophetic significance in Judaism and in the early church. And they are taken to refer to the coming king, the Messiah. So Psalm 2:2 says, "The rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you.'" So here we have the anointed one who is the son, and he is a king. Psalm 2 was read, we know, in Judaism in the time of the first century as a messianic psalm. In Qumran, Psalm 2:7 is combined with 2 Samuel 7:14, covenant made with David, as texts with a messianic expectation. And the Son of the Most High is at Qumran taken in a messianic context as well. So when we see Son and Son of God, we can certainly understand that as equivalent to the term Messiah. Ultimately, I'm going to argue that that is only part of the meaning of Son. It's not the full meaning of the language Son and Son of God. So at this point, we note that there is this overlap with the term Messiah. So in the Roman world, Son of God takes on a whole new meaning. The imperial cult spoke of Caesar as a god or son of God. A Gentile audience, hearing that Jesus was Son of God, would see this as a challenge to the imperial cult itself. Julius Caesar was declared by the Senate to be divine after his death. And that meant that the adopted son, Augustus Caesar, was the Son of God, the son of Julius Caesar. And so this language of Son of God becomes very popular in the Roman world to refer to the emperor. And that is well established before we're talking about Jesus' adult ministry and the writing of Mark's Gospel, when the language of Son of God is used. The Emperor Augustus dies in AD 14, for example. And when Mark writes his Gospel, he writes his Gospel in Rome, probably, in a Roman context. And so his very first verse is to direct a challenge against the Roman imperial cult by saying, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In what ways is Jesus Son of God in Mark's Gospel? One important passage is in Mark 14, verse 36, where Jesus is praying in Gethsemane and refers to God with the Aramaic term Abba, which means something like Papa. It's not so familiar that it would be translated as Daddy, and it's less formal than Father. So perhaps Papa is a good translation for Abba when we're thinking about English. And so it's like a special term because of its being a term of endearment. God and Jesus have a special relationship. Secondly, Jesus spoke of God as my Father, just as he also talked to his disciples about God as being your Father. But it's important to note that he never includes himself with the disciples and says, our Father. Yes, he teaches them to pray, our Father, but that's their prayer. So he is referring to God as his Father in a different way from how the disciples experience God as Father. Jesus has a more intimate relationship. Thirdly, Jesus is introduced as God's Son at his baptism. And Satan and the demons speak of Jesus as the Son of God. So here are some conclusions. Jesus' role as Son is unique. This uniqueness contributes to a divine sense of the title in the New Testament. The parable that Jesus tells of the wicked tenants also depicts Jesus as having a unique role as Son. Mark 12:6. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." And so, in the parable, he is distinct from all the other servants that have been sent because he is the son. Secondly, the Old Testament and Jewish background do not understand Son of God as a divine title, as we have seen, and Psalm 2:7 and following is key to identifying Jesus as Son of God. It is a messianic psalm speaking of divine authority. And then fourthly, the Roman context requires a divine understanding of the title. It was never understood in a physical son sense. All of this is very important. The current discussions about how to translate the Son of God language in a Muslim context have led some people to say, well, what we should do is substitute the Son of God language, the Son language, for just the term Messiah or Christ. We should equate the terms. And others have been arguing, no, they aren't the same. But the problem in the Muslim context is that for hundreds of years, Muslims have accused Christians for teaching that God had a son, which of course Christians have never done, in the sense that Roman gods would sire half divine or divine sons, the Greek and Roman gods. Now that's not Christian at all. The language of son is not used in any physical sense. It has to do with the relationship. So how do we get that across? Well, one question we have to ask as interpreters is, does Son of God actually mean something more than Messiah? And from what we've gone over in this lecture with regard to Mark's Gospel, as well as the background material, it seems like we have to say yes to that. There is more to Son of God in the title for Jesus, in Jesus' relationship to the Father, and in the Greco-Roman imperial world than just to equate it with Messiah. Another title that we meet in the Gospels is Son of Man. It's a title that only Jesus uses. Others do not call him Son of Man. Now, Son of Man can refer to someone. It can be a way of talking about a person as being mortal or human. A son of man would have to do then with someone who is mortal and not perhaps a son of a beast or a son of something else. That's exactly how it's used in Daniel 7. The beasts are presented as rulers of kingdoms, and then there's one who appears before the Ancient of Days who is like a son of man, who's distinct from those beastly rulers. And in that language, then, it's referring to someone who has the appearance of a human being and not a beast. Now, as we look at how the term Son of Man is used by Jesus in the Gospels, we see that it is a term that has several dimensions to it. Firstly, it refers to Jesus' earthly authority. The Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and so forth. Now, that earthly authority can be understood perfectly well with reference to the Daniel 7 verse 13 passage, where the one like a son of man appears before the Ancient of Days, because he is given authority And then he takes that authority to the earth. And that authority is an authority to judge in Daniel 7. Daniel 7 verse 13 does not use the term Son of Man as a title. He is one like a Son of Man, we read there. But when it is used in a titular way in the Gospels, one of the background passages that is extremely important is the Daniel 7:13 passage. It's referring to that Son of Man, that one back in Daniel 7:13. The second way in which we find Son of Man used in the Gospels is that the Son of Man will come in future judgment. And here again, it's directly related to the Daniel 7 passage. The Son of Man has the role of judgment. And then thirdly, the Son of Man is to suffer. Now here, there's no connection to Daniel 7. And so what we see is that the title takes on new meaning. It originates out of Daniel 7, but it takes on new meaning as Jesus uses it of himself. Yes, the one in Daniel 7, the one who has earthly authority, the one who is the future coming judge, that one, the Son of Man, must also suffer. That is how Jesus is using the title. There is a tremendous amount of discussion over decades about what Son of Man really means in the Gospels, and a lot of debate. So I don't want to skirt over that by my presentation here of three uses in the Gospels of Son of Man, but I do believe this is the best way to understand the terminology of Son of Man in the Gospels. The title Lord is also found in the Gospels and throughout the New Testament. It's a term, kurios, that can simply be translated as Sir, and we find that on occasion, like in Mark 7:28. But it is also a term that carries some sense of authority. There are some languages that have this kind of double meaning still today, like in Swahili, Bwana simply means Sir or Mister, but it can also be a way of referring to God as Lord. And that is, of course, the history of the word Lord in English, Older English. It's just come to be specifically used now for God in our day and age. Kurios can mean someone in authority then, and it is a term, thirdly, that we find throughout the Old Testament. The term Adonai in Hebrew means Lord, and so kurios is simply a translation for Lord in those passages. But also the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew word for Yahweh was kurios. So the language kurios comes to be used much more in the Old Testament. It's covering both Adonai and Yahweh in Old Testament passages. And this kind of translation then allowed the early church to read Jesus into passages that refer to kurios in the Old Testament. Jesus, who is called Lord, is then found in the Old Testament where kurios is the translation in the Septuagint. And then kurios can refer to Jesus' exalted status, indeed approaching a divine title. That, again, is something that this Old Testament translation helps along. If we're going to refer to God in this way, and we refer to Jesus in this way, well, then we can talk about Jesus as fulfilling those passages that refer to God in the Old Testament. Now I'd like to focus finally some attention on Jesus' divinity in Mark's Gospel, because we've raised questions about these titles and these understandings of who Jesus is, and explored different possible meanings for the terms, and that's left us somewhat vague about exactly whether Mark is trying to claim divinity for Jesus. And so I think that we should conclude with a comment about that. And for this part of the lecture, I want to draw your attention to the story of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. The story can be found in Mark chapter 4, in Matthew chapter 8, and in Luke chapter 8. And you can see with the yellow here that there is literary dependence and relationship on the part of Matthew and Luke with the story in Mark. Although interestingly, there's some more than normal overlap between Matthew and Luke, where Mark is not present in a story that Mark also has. That's illustrated with the purple here. And there's closer connection between Mark and Matthew because we not only have the yellow, but we also have the red between Mark and Matthew. Mark has been reduced in word number by Matthew, as is typical, and you can see that just in terms of the size of the columns as you compare Mark 4 and Matthew 8. Even though we're doing all of this in English, we can make these comparisons. Now, the story is a story that we know so well. Jesus is with the disciples on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. A storm comes up. He is asleep, and they wake him up and ask him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And so he gets up and rebukes the wind and speaks to the sea, and everything becomes perfectly calm. And then he asks them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And then the result of this in Mark 4:41 is that the disciples are afraid because they are wondering who this is in the boat with them. And they ask, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, the reader of the Old Testament will have in his or her mind Psalm 107 when reading the story of Jesus and the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. And I'll read a few verses from that psalm. "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." In verse 23, "Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep." And so far the two uses of the term Lord and one coming up that are in capital letters in this translation. Behind that would refer to the Hebrew word Yahweh if reading the Hebrew, but if reading the Septuagint, it would be Kurios. "For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their calamity. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven." So the Psalm 107 in the background of the story of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee brings about the idea that the answer to the disciples' question, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" The answer to that is, well, it's God. God is present and in our midst. And so while the titles of Jesus in the Gospels capture different aspects of Jesus' ministry, they are fulfilled and are fulfilled in who Jesus was. Yet the titles are ultimately inadequate if they don't ultimately lead you to make the confession that Jesus is Lord, and by that mean that he is divine. And that ends then our lecture on Mark's Gospel.